because this is Brazilian Day. So we have to show our happiness, our samba style, and those kind of things. So thank you. No, it is the first event of this Brazilian Day. I am so delighted to be with you. And this is about NDCs as investment plans. So two connections. NDCs, as we know, are those climate plans mandated by since Warsaw, but mostly because of the Paris Agreement, that should identify targets to move our countries towards a net zero objective. We know well what it's that, but investment, that it is a fully different concept. So let me make this opening by connecting or by trying to connect three dots. The first one about NDCs itself. We know that unfortunately, at least until now, I'm referring to the word, we have not been able, not yet, to produce or to develop NDCs to put the world well on track to the 1.5. I don't know if the recent climate carbon tracker, I always confuse the name, report, it is saying that we would raise temperature with the current NDCs to 2.7 degrees. That means that we still have a lot to do. But we are entering into a new cycle of NDCs soon. The deadline is February. It could be probably until June. And we are expecting not to have too much more. That would be sad, but we have to do our main effort to avoid that. And fortunately, we have initiative as the NDC partnership that it is strongly working on that. Because, and let me use this analogy, we shouldn't repeat what used to happen with iPhone 15 versus iPhone 14. It was exactly the same, no? So we do need to produce something that can make the difference. That is the only way in which we will achieve our climate objective. But to do that, and 2 days ago I was discussing with people from the German delegation plus OECD, how can we promote the economic case for NDCs? I think that is a key element when it is about investment. We have to promote an economic case for NDCs. Because, and this is not my phrase, it is from Helen Mountford, I heard her, she used to manage the Global Commission for Climate and the Economy. She mentioned this: nobody in any place of the world go to vote because of an NDC. No? Nobody knows even what does it mean, an NDC, even less NCQG. Who knows what it is NCQG when we are talking about common citizens? But probably even worse, people don't care of those titles. People are fully worried on economy, jobs, employment, health, security, and those kind of things. So we have to translate this global debate into citizens. And let me put an example. Probably the US, it is one of those good examples. What it has been historically in the US, the most effective climate law, the one that it is called Inflation Reduction Act, because it is connecting with people's main concerns, inflation, the economy. So sometimes we have to do that to see how can we use the policies to connect with people, because if not, it will be very difficult to promote a better engagement of citizens. That also it would be, or it must be, the way to demand to our governments to enhance ambitions through the NDC. So that in relation to the domestic level. But also what we do need is to have clear NDCs with a clear vision. So something that it is so important, we are almost talking about NDCs, and I would like to suggest that in the future we can say NDCs plus long-term strategies, because an NDC without a long-term strategy, it could be a chaotic plan. The idea it is to connect with a long-term vision. That is so important. The point it is that what we have to transmit with the NDC, it is a clear vision for the country, probably to organize it in a better way if it is around the transitions, clear transition for the country. Where do we want to go, and how are we planning to be there? And that it is very important, because if not, it will be more difficult to create that economic case. But also now let me move into the finance side. We know that the official development assistance, ODA, it will never be enough. We know that. there are always some constraints when it is about ODA. We know that when it is about just philanthropy, will never be enough. We have to promote investment. We have to define incentives to promote those investments. But to do that, we have to make our own work. Yesterday in a panel, I was saying, it is not that we will put a bucket in front of us to receive coins. No, it is that we have to be well prepared to receive investors that can strengthen our actions towards fulfilling with our NDCs. And in that sense, there is a paper from Germany about 3 pillars of climate finance policy that I do want to share with you quickly. Taxes, carbon pricing, energy taxes, because it is true. What we do need is to put a price to carbon. And by doing that, by incentivize or disincentivize some conducts. Because if not, we will receive the waste from the north. The idea it is to have our own rules, to develop our own technology, to develop our own plans that can guide us to be net zero in some time, at least, no more than 2050. But also what we do need is to gear our tax system, to change, to shift our tax system. Look, if you just take a second and go back into your mind and to think how the fiscal and the tax system or fiscal system it is working in my country, probably you will realize immediately that we are promoting non-sustainable activities. So what are those changes that we have to promote? Second, subsidies. Exactly the same. We are still defining subsidies for non-sustainable activities, for diesel, for transport. And sometimes, look, it is so difficult. Sometimes it is for social consideration. I remember in Peru when some tax for diesel was reduced because a social demonstration of the drivers of trucks. So to attend a social consideration, we did something that it is non-sustainable. How can we manage that? And finally, to promote investment. But to promote investment also means, for example, to use mechanisms as the green bonds or to use taxonomies. 2 days ago, I got a very good document because now there is a taxonomy for resilience. For me, it's fantastic because we used to have taxonomies for mitigation. So I am taking too much time, sorry for that. It is Brazilian style. So, thank you. I know how to adopt the Brazilian style. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you for being here in COP29. And let's move all of our effort towards a strong, successful COP30 in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. After all, it's Brazilian Day, right? So let's continue with our panel. Let me introduce myself. I didn't in the beginning. I'm Tatiana Oliveira. I'm from WWF Brazil, and I will be conducting this panel today. I know in your programs you have the name of Fernanda, and I have this very, very incredibly difficult task to be studying for her, but I will do my best, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, let's move forward. It's very nice to have you all here. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your availability. Let's start with Aloysio from the Brazilian government. Aloysio, please, I'd like to ask you to start by presenting yourself and also reminding us, as Manuel was just saying, we now have this very complex mosaic of financing instruments to finance ambitious NDCs. So I'd like to ask you, how is the Brazilian government approaching to those instruments, and how can we promote ambitious NDCs with what is at stake now, what's on the table?
Okay, thank you, Tatiana. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to my colleagues of this panel. Manuel, thank you for the initial words. What I would like to share with you is how we are approaching this challenge of increasing investments, public and private to meet our NDC targets. As you have seen, last week we delivered our new NDC with the new target to getting to up to 67% of GHG emissions reductions based 2005, in line with our commitment to be neutral in all greenhouse gases by 2050. So this is, I think, a big challenge, but also it was based on initial in some assessments, some modeling work, some discussions with private stakeholders, many organizations, and inside the government, with a view that okay, that must be ambitious, but that also must be feasible in terms of implementation. So was a great part of the discussion. Can we do it? How can we do it? Do we have the instruments right now? Will we have the instruments along this period of implementation? And what I will share with you is some of these steps that we have already taken and how we are building this framework very quickly. But first, some of the challenges of the NDC. They are related to mobilizing public resources, and we are doing that a lot, but also enabling conditions to mobilize private resources in areas such as, well, reducing deforestation, which is key for us. And for that, we will need to mobilize besides command and control, but also align the incentives that we have already for the agricultural sector, but new incentives, new public money to incentivize that we will be able to reduce all kinds of forestation, let's say, because they have those different dynamics. But also forest restoration, and that involves also public resources. We are mobilizing that through the BNDES, our national bank, with a ambitious strategy to make the reforestation the arch of reforestation along the southeast of Amazon. Like, it's ambitious, like 6 uh, uh, million hectares of forest restoration in the next 10, 15 years. And for that, public finance from BNDES. And also, besides the finance, some the risking mechanisms. It's a new guarantee instrument also with BNDES, but that as a means to prepare to enable investment from private sector as well. This is already starting to happen, and from the climate fund, we are already financing private initiatives of investment. So this is a big part of it. But besides that, we need to advance in substituting or replacing fossil fuels along the period with the new, more advanced biofuels, the synthetic biofuels, and for that, we will also need public resources, but a lot of private investment, and also in transport, in waste with public resources. So this is the kind of the areas of action in industry as well, replacing technologies. So how we are building the instruments to do that. In terms of public resources, we have those two emissions or issuances of sovereign bonds, sustainable sovereign bonds. That funding was directed to the climate fund and also to a new strategy, EcoInvest, and that was basically for increase the funding, and so that's at the end public resources, and we are directing that for our climate strategy. This year, from January to September, October, we BNDES, our national bank, approved like $1.5 billion in the climate fund in those areas. And that is a lot. It was more that we approved in the last 11 years of the climate fund. So this year, what we approved is 2.5 times what we approved in the whole history of the fund. So mobilizing a lot of public resources. Besides public resources for funding the projects, the other key area was how can we reduce the risk of public investment, and especially mainly of foreign investment in those key areas in Brazil. So this is the kind of composition that we think is necessary in terms of public sector, public resources, investing in some de-risking instruments to allow the private investments. And one of the key things was the foreign exchange risk. So if you have investment in dollars in Brazil, would be applying in a sector that will be invested in our currency, in reais, how can we guarantee that this volatility of the foreign will not disincentivize this? So what we are doing is putting money also in to offer to the investors more long-term hedging protection to that kind of foreign exchange volatility. You know, so it's a more specific, sophisticated investment to use public resources as a catalytic in a catalytic way to allow the private investment to say, okay, we can do that. We can go there and invest in those activities. So this is the kind of composition that we are doing in terms of using public resources as a funding to finance some key areas, but mostly in advancing to use it in a more strategic way, because the amount of investment that we need in order to make the transitions, the transformations of in those markets in Brazil is a big amount, and without those private resources for the more mature activities, we will not do that. And just to finalize, I'm talking about mitigation, but just to say that public resources, the greatest priority is we need to invest in adaptation. Some of the key areas, even for mitigation and adaptation, like not nature-based solutions, they will need the public resources. So this is the kind of composition. How do we make the strategic use of the domestic resources, public resources from multilaterals and other sources, in a way that we guarantee that the basic thing that only can be made with public resources is going to be made, but also allowing the private sector to say, okay, in these areas I can invest in the public resources, helping to create this enabling environment for the private sector as well.
Thank you, Aloysio. So let's follow up with Rita. Um, in terms of needs, I'm sorry, the Windy City. In terms of needs, in technical and governance capacity building, what do you think is needed to have an ambitious NDC for developing countries? What is at stake here?
All right, thank you very much, Tatiana, and WWF for having the African Development Bank here. I think it's Brazilian Day, but Brazil and Africa have a lot in common. So thanks for that, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk about the work we do at the African Development Bank. I think what's interesting is that as countries are being requested to increase ambition, the support to increase that ambition is not so forthcoming. And so that in itself is a disadvantage for a lot of developing countries starting with. But at the same time, I think positioning NDCs as investment plans is critical. If there is a business case for it, then you're able to, if they are designed from a business perspective, then you're able to crowd in both public finance as well as private sector finance. I also want to make an observation that as we are going into NDC 3.0, a lot of the foundation has been set. I recall in 2015, when countries had submitted their INDCs, it was very broad. There wasn't a lot of clarity because there was a push right before the Paris COP to have something on the table. So a lot of those documents were prepared in a rush. And I remember I was working for UNDP at the time, and UNDP provided a lot of support to African countries, including Ghana, where I worked, to prepare these INDCs. So if you look at the NDCs currently, there's been a lot of evolution, as well as an important comment that the opening remarks speaker mentioned, is the need to situate them in long-term visions or long-term strategies. And I think while that long-term strategy is now coming on the table, countries are designing that. We've already gone through 2 rounds of NDCs. However, the push to have long-term strategies are very important for countries then to start emanating their NDCs from them. Having said that, I believe in response to the question that is asked, there are several technical needs that are required. For the sake of time, I want to focus on a couple. This is uh, while we've done so well with the two rounds of NDCs to strengthen institutional and technical capacities of institutions in country to design their own NDCs, to implement them, there is still going to be a need to provide that level of support. How can we do this? How can we design and plan NDCs and implement them? We will need finance. I think it's a bit unfair to ask countries, developing countries, to design NDCs using debt resources. And so it's important, and even at the African Development Bank, we are already receiving requests from African countries which are regional member countries to provide grant resources to help them to meet the February 2025 target of submitting NDCs. And I will talk a little bit about some of the technical assistance grants that we've put in place to help our countries do exactly that. Um, I want to also make a reference to the UNFCCC 2023 NDC synthesis report that highlights for all of us that 75% of parties that had submitted their NDCs as of September 2023 still identified capacity building needs, such as formulating policies, integrating mitigation and adaptation into sectoral planning, assessing finance, and providing clarity, transparency, and understanding of NDCs as prerequisites for them to successfully implement their NDCs. These are these are things that we need to be aware of, and I believe for us to even have these discussions on NDCs as investment plans, we need to start from this understanding. Um, to some extent, I think NDCs as investment plans are already happening. From the INDCs, it later came that, of course, countries had to maybe think to design NDCs as NDC investment plans separately from what they had already submitted. But I think NDC 3.0 we should not have two separate documents where you have NDCs as broad target. You should already design them as investment plans. And I want to link it to something that the MDBs do, and in the context that also for all of us that MDBs are increasingly providing climate finance. They have targets to be Paris aligned since 2023. And at the African Development Bank, this is something that we are constantly doing. And so I believe that there is a need to bring these two together, NDCs as investment plans and the financing that multilateral development banks provide. Um, Last week, the MDBs launched the joint report on climate finance, which shows that there has been an increase in climate finance provided. I think for us, again, having this conversation as NDCs as investment plans, it's important to have coherence between what the financing that the MDBs are providing, as well as the financing that we want to tap into through our NDCs investment plans. Let me make the point that as MDBs, we design country strategy papers. Country strategy papers for MDBs are the investments that MDBs want to make in a country in a 5-year period. And NDCs are also 5-year period. Of course, the timelines may not align, but what is important is that in these country strategy papers, we already have identified investments that need to go into those countries. What is important is that we link the NDCs to these MDBs country strategy papers. We have several MDBs working in our countries, and I think it's only practical for us to do this. I have a few minutes left, so let me just quickly share what the African Development Bank is doing. So at the African Development Bank, we have several technical assistance windows. Last week at the Africa Pavilion, we launched what we call the Climate Action Window Technical Assistance Sub-Window. And what it seeks to do is to provide grants financing up to 1.3 million to our regional member countries to design their NDCs. Not only that, we also identified that they will need to develop, of course, projects not just emanating from MDBs, but also from the NDCs. So project preparatory grants can also be accessed through this grant finance. And then also we have the Africa NDC Hub, which is a coordination platform with WWF as a partner and other 21 partners in all. And the idea of the Africa NDC Hub is to act as a coordination platform for NDC implementation. And through that, a lot of support has been provided to African countries to be able to implement the NDCs. And finally, I coordinate a trust fund at the African Development Bank, which is called the Africa Climate Change Fund, which also provide grant financing for countries to design the NDCs or revise the NDCs, design long-term strategies. Currently, we are providing support to 4 African countries, Gabon, Liberia, Lesotho, and Botswana, to design their long-term visions, also in line with the NDCs. Let me end here.
Thank you so much, Rita, from the Africa Development Bank. Yeah, I think by now we see that public money and private money will all be needed to implement ambitious NDCs from a various scope of sources, right? I'd like to ask Peter, Pablo, sorry, from the NDC partnership. What's your vision? What would be the criteria for those very ambitious NDCs countries should present by February next year, maybe, so that we can align NDCs with the 1.5 target? Yeah, and how can we finance those, in your opinion, as well?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. I think that one of the critical elements of the progression of countries going through 3 rounds of developing NDCs or updating NDCs has produced a lot of good lessons. And of course, in many countries, the INDC was produced by a fly-in, fly-out consultant that barely knew the country. And that is the reality. We're in a rush. We wanted to put a big, all countries to put forward their INDCs before Paris to get a deal. But when countries went back home and started looking at, now what do I do with this, there was a lot that they needed to do. And the NDC partnership was launched back in 2016 to support countries implement their NDCs. And the first conversations we had with countries is, okay, now what? No? In many cases, this was just in the hands of ministers of environment. They hadn't even talked to ministers of finance or energy or agriculture about the goals that were already there. They had a target, but without clarity in terms of how it would be split among sectors and what would be the actions to achieve that. And of course, there was a huge range in terms of the quality of the NDC. Some countries did have some time and resources and did it in a way that was better than others, but there was a huge difference. So a lot of the support that we provided over the first few years to countries was foundational support, trying to understand what an NDC is, how to engage the relevant stakeholders, and then how to identify the activities, maybe cost them, and then figure out how to implement them. For the second round, there was a lot of discussion about how do we increase the quality and strengthen the processes so that NDCs are not just from ministries of environment, but more of a whole of government approach, and then ideally whole of society. So consultation processes that will bring in those critical stakeholders to the table that were not done in the rush of the first time, and maybe countries having a little more time to do these things. And then the quality in terms of the data, the modeling, and all the information, and ideally linking them already with long-term visions in a way to bring that forward. And then now into the third one, looking at the challenges, especially the challenges in implementing those, even those higher quality NDCs, second NDCs, was how do we make them implementable and investable? And implementable means a lot quality, but also are they realistic? Are they viable? Are they owned by the government? Is there the leadership in place to do this? And investable, it's costing, starting with that, but also mapping relevant stakeholders and bringing them to the table. private sector should be in the conversation in the development of the NDC, not afterwards, so that they feed into what the NDC needs to have and how it needs to look. So all of those are critical elements to guarantee that NDCs are, as we're all talking, the NDCs 3.0, high quality, implementable, investable, apart from being more ambitious and ideally aligned with the 1.5 degrees and reflecting on the outcomes of the global stocktake. So those are critical elements that need a lot of support, because as we ask more of countries, whole of economy, all gases, all these things, that means that the time needed, the resources needed increases, and that means that technical assistance that needs to be available needs to be also bigger and readily available and flexible for countries to do their processes. We're supporting 67 countries update their NDCs or review their NDCs, and at COP we've heard at least, I don't know, a dozen more that will come forward. So we're talking about countries that are starting the development of their NDCs 2 months before the deadline, which is not viable. And for us, quality is a lot more important than a deadline. So we're encouraging countries to do this the right way. Because if they once again come forward with an NDC that is not realistic, implementable, owned, then it's going to be a challenge to move forward. So take the time, let's mobilize the support that you need so that we can provide what you need to have an NDC that can be submitted before Belém, but that is really implementable. So the next challenge is, okay, you have the NDC. NDCs 3.0 should send a very strong signal in terms of the direction of travel of the government, in terms of where they're going, in terms of their development pathway, and they need to mobilize finance, including from the private sector. So what we're seeing is that incredible frustration, even there's commitment to develop these NDCs, incredible frustration because finance has not been mobilized. But also the realization that public will never be enough, that even though there's important discussions on the NCQG, this will be only part of the solution. You need to use that, ideally, as Brazil is talking about, use public finance to leverage private finance in an effective way and bring others, and then prioritize areas that will be very difficult for private finance, like adaptation, to use the public available finance. So what we're seeing is that countries, when they look at this, we receive requests, for example, for a project, a one-liner or a two-pager with no climate rationale, with no clarity on sources of finance, with no real bankability, with no finance mechanisms. So how do we help? We go back to countries and we develop with the GCF a climate investment planning and mobilization framework that allows countries to think about this more broadly. Do you have the right policies in place? Are you bringing the ministers of finance? Are you looking at your debt capacity? Are you looking at mechanisms that will allow you to risk, to blend? Are you developing projects based on who the taker will be so that you can be effective? Are you using resources like the MDPs, like the GCF, like your own domestic finance to mobilize private sector? No, and all of those elements will go into that. And currently we have requests from 73 countries to move forward with investment planning for their NDCs. But I do have to say something. I don't agree that NDCs are investment plans. If you have an NDC that is whole of economy, all gases, you cannot have one investment plan for that. It's impossible. That's more complicated than having one investment plan for your development plan. You need to look at NDCs, identify those critical areas, prioritize actions, maybe through an implementation plan, and then develop programmatic investment plans, be it sectoral or thematic. You can have multiple investment plans that will allow you to implement your NDC and use the 10 years to do it in an effective way, because the policies associated with energy transition are not the same as the policies needed for adaptation. The sources of finance are not going to be the same. The finance mechanisms are not going to be the same. So you need to be clear in terms of what are those and then develop it. Rwanda, for example, has developed 3 investment plans based on their current NDC. One is for their rural agriculture land use transition. The other one is for energy, and the other one is for cities. They're very, very different in their content and their sources of finance. So I think that supporting countries on identifying those priorities and then developing those investment plans will, and to close, change the dynamic that Manuel was mentioning, which is not the right one. Developing countries should not put a bucket and ask philanthropies, private sector, MDBs, funds, donors to put money in there and then figure out what to do. We need to flip the script. Countries need to have strong NDCs with implementation plans, with investment plans that have a clear understanding of where finance is coming and how it's going to be used so that they become attractive to investors, that become a good place for donors to put their money in, for philanthropies to invest. No, that, if we do that, then there's an option for every country to mobilize and implement their NDCs instead of waiting to be picked for the next Jet B by a developed country or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulo. We will have time for one or two questions from the audience, but I would like to start with a third question, asking you, I mean all of you, to expand a little bit more on how to de-risk this investment and how can we bring climate justice to the conversation. We've talked a lot about investments and what are the proper criteria to attract investments to implement NDCs. But there is this element missing. How do we actually promote common goods to people in countries and public international public goods by implementing NDCs and by getting us back on track to 1.5 goal. The other question would be, we've been talking about NDCs, mostly mitigation. And to deliver climate justice, we have to bring adaptation and loss and damage to the conversation, but also how can we also make or bring to this conversation biodiversity. We are facing this very difficult scenario on biodiversity. We just finished the CDB with no finance agreement relating to financing biodiversity protection and conservation. So how do we bring, in a nutshell, climate justice and biodiversity to this conversation? Before I give you the floor again, let's hear one or two questions from the audience. Anyone?
Thank you. I'd like to know, especially for the transition away from fossil fuel, how do you think it will be possible for countries that has an economy very based on this kind of economy? Thank you very much.
One more?
Hi, Tracy Wyman from Science Based Targets Initiative. I'd like to know from any of the panelists who have an opinion how you see the role of the private sector in contributing to achieving NDCs and how you see governments linking to the private sector to make that possible, to steer them.
Thank you. Thank you all for the questions. I give you the floor. Who wants to start? Aloysio.
Yes, I can start, and I'm sorry that I will have to leave a little bit earlier than 10 because I have another to be far away from here at 10, so I have to run through the corridors. But I could see we have actually 5 questions. I'm not be able to address all of them. But first, the risking thing. We think that this is maybe the key, one of the key things that we need to address if you want that to have private resources in those key areas for our NDCs. How we are addressing that in a practical way in Brazil? First of all, the risking, it's different kinds of risk, different layers. So you go from the macroeconomic context of each country. Then you go for the regulatory basis for the sectors, the activities. For instance, we approved the new legislation from hydrogen, for the fuels for the future, for the development of the new fuels. So this kind of we are trying to address that level of regulatory certainty as part of this process for the private investor understand what are the perspectives, what the direction, and then specifically at the project level, how to address that. different kinds of risk, different approaches, different kinds of instruments. I mentioned before the thing of the foreign exchange rate volatility as one of the areas, and the other related to that is that companies need to have liquidity to deal with this kind of volatility. We are doing that in the eco-invest eco-investor strategy through different instruments. We are addressing that and the risk of the activities. And for instance, in the restoration area, we are doing that through BNDES, through specific guarantee fund guarantee instruments. So this is the kind of a composition I think it's necessary to build from the macro perspective, regulatory side, and specific instrument. And I think this is what I think the one frontier, let's say, one area where multilaterals must develop, and they need to deliver much more practical solutions for that for the countries. We expect that from. We are doing this with IDB, with this thing of eco-invest and so on, but we need much more of that, and those institutions they are doing that in some ways, in some aspects, but this is the area of dialogue that countries need to advance with multilaterals, with bilateral institutions, with the domestic. So this is, and we do think that this is fundamental if we want to make actual transformations in many of those markets where private investment has a role to play. And biodiversity, I think, is we have to connect those areas, how to finance biodiversity, how to finance climate. For us, the strategy to make forest restoration with native species and complex restoration systems can be part of that. We are addressing that through this ambitious target of our NDC to restore 12 million hectares until 2030 and 9 million hectares after that. And I think this is the kind of one of the possible solutions. Even in the urban area, the urban component of our NDC is also looking at nature-based solutions in urban areas. In the coastal area, the ocean areas, the role of mangroves. So we need to connect mitigation solutions, adaptation solutions, and drive those, enable investments in order to do that. This is part of the thing. Just to mention one final aspect is related to the thing of NDC. Is NDC a platform for investment or not? I think things are connected. And our NDC, many pages there, if you could see. But we are saying, oh, this is the country that we see for the future. This is the pathway. This is the areas of priority. This is the developments that we want to make in each of those areas. The projects are not there, but the context, the narrative, the priorities, including in how we are transitioning away from fossil fuels. This is there. We talk about that. But what we built is another instrument with the Brazilian investment platform for climate and ecological transformation. It's already in place. We have launched that last week in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. The projects are already there. So what we did say, we said we have 3 big priority areas: land use and bioeconomy, in industry and circular economy, and energy, the whole thing. We have a steering committee that will assess private projects in order to say if they are complying with these areas of priority, if they have impact indicators, if they are complying with safeguards, and this is addressing somehow one of the aspects of just transition. If they are good enough, they go to the platform, and we are saying, okay, these are investable projects. They are ready to be invested in. So we are calling investors to say, if you want to do the good thing, the right thing, if you got to put your money in impact investments, these are the projects we have in the initial, when we launched the platform. Some projects there, 7 or 8 projects in very different areas. It's like almost $2 billion for private investment. So this is a kind of a way to connect NDCs with actual investment projects and to showcase how, in practical ways, how the NDC translates into project to communicate that to the private sector. thank you very much. Sorry for the time and sorry that I really will have to leave.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
all of you.
Aloysio. We Brazilians sure had a busy week with a many pages NDC and G20 yesterday. Yeah, and following with COP30 next year. So thank you so much. Paulo and Rita, you have
Yes.
both 5 minutes each.
Okay. Uh, so, yeah, a lot of questions and a lot of complex things, and just I'll try to complement some of the things that have been said. In terms of de-risking, I think that one critical element is bringing in other stakeholders like the ministers of finance and the central banks to the table. And there again, I think that MDBs are critical stakeholder as these are their shareholders and their focal points, and help provide support to this ministers of finance to really take on the responsibility to drive forward climate, including by managing the risk and investing domestic resources and using the resources from the MDBs, for example, to drive this. So we work closely with the Coalition of Finance Ministers, and we even launched an initiative last year to support ministers of finance from developing countries to advance the preparation of NDCs 3.0. The central banks are also critical because they have the responsibility of producing the regulatory frameworks that will bring the financial institutions to the table. And also the development of taxonomies, which will define what is green and what's not green, and do risk assessments, looking at the impacts of climate on the financial sector. So those are all critical elements to feed into risk management tools, but bringing resources from guarantee facilities or blending facilities or insurance facilities is also critical, and developing countries need those resources that come normally from developed countries to support their efforts or from MDBs. In terms of climate justice, I think a critical element is strong participation and inclusion from the beginning. As I was saying before, one of the critical elements that made second round of NDCs and will make third round of NDCs better is that countries are receiving support to have these conversations. One of the things that we realized when we started to support the second round of NDCs is that normally governments don't have the resources to do these consultations. They take time, they are resource intensive, and normally donors and institutions don't provide support for that. So there was a huge gap there to bring civil society, to bring communities to the table, to have a conversation around youth engagement, about gender inclusion, to bring the indigenous people to the table, to bring the private sector to the table. So providing resources and support for those conversations to happen in the preparation of this NDC allows for those just transition elements to be included, and also generates that ownership by relevant stakeholders, that the transition will not affect as much people if people are prepared for that transition and have the relevant skills to be able to take this on. It will generate new jobs instead of job losses. It will allow people to transition from one job to the other instead of losing the job. So that is critical. The elements of biodiversity, there's complete synergies in the processes, and these conversations that have been happening over the last couple of years by trying to bring together the conventions, even the instruments like the NDCs and the MBSAPs is fundamental. It's fundamental because there's a lot of synergies amongst the two, but also because finance is the same finance at the end of the day. So looking at there's not going to be a different pot of money for the two things. So bringing them together, we will allow each other to mobilize finance more effectively. And finally, private sector. Like Just Transition, they need to be part of the conversation from the beginning. They need to set the tone in terms of what is needed, what are the policy enablers, discuss the carrots and the sticks, and be part of the conversation. And there is no question, this is not a nice to have. Private sector needs to be part of the conversation and needs to be engaged in the implementation of the NDCs. Without the private sector, it will not happen.
Thank you so much. Let me just spin the question a little bit. The Secretary General of the United Nations is pledging for not actually de-risking, but risk sharing on implementing NDCs and climate goals. Could you address this small spin in the perspective in relation to private investments to the climate goal, and also if you could focus on the climate justice um, issue, I would appreciate it very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I wanted to add on domestic climate finance mobilization, but you took me in a different direction. Um, it's okay. But I think, how many minutes? Okay. All right. So I think it's important to also touch on the domestic climate finance, private sector climate finance mobilization, because that's something that is also left out of the equation. In developing countries, we have a lot of informal sector. We also have a lot of, even in the banking sector, we have different microfinance institutions, different banks, private sector banks, etc., which are already investing in things like agriculture, in energy, but there is no clear pathway to linking them to countries' NDCs. And so for, I thought you were speaking to you. And so for, I think for the African Development Bank, what we have done is that in order to bring the domestic banks that are involved or that are doing things on their own to this conversation of NDCs investment and bringing everybody on board, ensuring that we can properly articulate what is happening at the country level, what is coming in through foreign direct investments, and be able to tell clearly, okay, this is what we have, this is what is left, and use that to leverage additional financing is important. So in line with that, we have the Green Bank initiatives, which is really bringing in private banks at the country level, building their capacity to develop ESG taxonomies to green their portfolios as a means to properly link them to countries' NDCs is important. I think Pablo has said it. In terms of climate justice, we see at least the NDCs that I was involved in at the country level, you see more and more a clearly defined, in most countries, national climate change committees who are tasked with designing the country's NDCs, and often they are led by the ministries of environment. I think for NDC 3.0, for it to be powerful, we need to, well, first of all, have the resources to bring on board additional stakeholders. Of course, when you have a group of people working on these two over time, they have this bond that is formed, which is important to develop it faster. But for us to ensure that the country buys into it, the ministries of finance that comes to the development banks to borrow on behalf of their countries buy into it, we need to expand that scope. And to do that, we need finance. I think that's where, if you can ensure that everybody is at the table in designing the NDCs, that's how we can maybe move closer to having that inclusivity from the country level to the international level. I've not spoken on the NC on having that private sector, public sector financing, but just to quickly add, I think the speaker from Brazil emphasized that yes, and also to connect to the lady who asked the question how private sector can invest. Private sector is already investing in mitigation, but they are not doing so much in adaptation. So there is a need somehow to, I don't want to say, to find a way to attract them into adaptation. And sometimes is to see how we can use the public sector resources we've been able to mobilize to bring them in. And so here there are different instruments. Concessional loans mixed with grant financing is the way to go. I'm sorry, there's not much time. So I think this is what I would like to add to the conversation. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Paulo, Rita. I think we had a great panel today. Thank you so much for your contributions. As we don't have extra time, I will close it and let's wait for the next one. Thank you. See you in COP30. See you in Belém.